Hey, we've arrived. This is it in the book of Nehemiah. The completion of the wall is recorded in today's text. We're in Nehemiah chapter 6, beginning in verse 15. Are you ready? The wall was completed in 52 days, on the 25th day of the month of Elul. When all our enemies heard this, all the surrounding nations were intimidated and lost their confidence, for they realized that this task had been accomplished by our God. Man, after all the pushback, and after all the sabotage, and after all the infighting, and after all the guts it took to muster and pray for compassion from God to approach King Artaxerxes of Persia to get what he needed, after all the logistics, all the hard work, the physical laboring not only with an entire force already, but laboring with a force cut in half while half of them stood guard, and then the remaining half effectively cut in half while one half has a trowel, the other hand has a sword, and after all of that, it is finally completed. And by the way, it's completed in 52 days. Which is pretty impressive. If you're a general contractor, write out to us at jessecampbellministries.com. Send us a message, or here on YouTube or wherever it is you listen to us, and let us know what you think of that. A 52-day completion rate for a volunteer-based rally construction project to rebuild a wall that had been effectively burned. So let us know your thoughts on that. If you're a general contractor, if you work in construction, give us your take, because it sounds impressive to me, man. To rally volunteers before they had bobcats and excavators and before they had bulldozers and before they had cranes. I mean, this was just volunteers with, swords. And they rebuilt a wall around the city. It's amazing to me. It's also 100% credited to God, even by the enemies of Israel. So the wall's completed in 52 days. And when all their enemies hear this is verse 16, they lose their confidence because they realize that this task had been accomplished by the Israelites' God. There are, to be sure, some leadership lessons you can take from the book of Nehemiah, but it's not a book on leadership. There's a story of leadership that runs the length of it, but that's not the purpose of the book of Nehemiah. I, for example, admire Nehemiah's candidness, the way that he would walk and look at the ruin of the wall himself and take inventory himself. And he would have people run a census just to see how many people they really had. And he would be upfront and very forthright about their disgraced status. But this is not a book on Nehemiah's leadership. I admire that Nehemiah as well. Another leadership thing that you could take away from this book is the way that even though Nehemiah was constantly brushing off the enemy and brushing off the enemy and brushing off the enemy, when there was an internal dispute among the people of God, he was like, time out, stop the presses, everybody get together right now, we're resolving this instantly. I mean, like, his enemies were trying to get him to come down away from his work multiple times, like 4 different times. He would say, nope. But when he saw that there was a dispute in-house among the people of God, everything shuts down. Construction stops. Get together, work this out. Like, I admire that. But even still, the book of Nehemiah is not a leadership book. It is something that God accomplishes to literally facilitate, most importantly, revival. It's about this spiritual revival that God brings about. And by the way, there's a building campaign that runs the length of the whole story. That's why at the Redemption Church, this is what we're studying as we launch our 2-year building campaign. Because we're an expository church, and we can't take a text and pretend like it says something about a building campaign. So we took the book in the Bible that has to do with a building campaign, and we've named our project the Revival Project because that's at the crux of this book. It's not about the wall. You'll notice that there's nothing describing the wall architecturally. We know that at a certain point they build it up to half of its height, and that's about all that's really said about the construction of the wall. There's nothing about the angle or the composition of the mortar that was used, the condition of the stones, or how they removed some of the charring and soot and burn marks from the stone itself. None of that really matters. The construction project itself almost doesn't matter, but what it does is facilitates revival. It puts a wall up around the city of Jerusalem so you can see, now I'm in the city of Jerusalem, now I'm not. What it does is facilitate and contain revival. So we have named our project the Revival Project. This is a story about God's hand on his people, bringing about revival and then literally facilitating it with a building campaign. Nehemiah is his servant, and he's obedient, to be sure. There are moments of leadership brilliance, to be sure. But in the end, God gets all of the glory, 100% of the glory for the building campaign, for the construction project, and most importantly, for the spiritual revival that takes place among his people. Even the enemies of Israel, in verse 16, acknowledge God's the one who did that. Their God is the one who accomplished that. God gets all of the glory for it. It's about the unseen hand of God orchestrating his will in his people, whom he allowed to be scattered just as he warned they would be. And then just as he promised he would, as they repent, he brings them back home again. It's about God bringing about revival in his people. The building is incidental to that. It literally just facilitates it. So don't take too much credit for what God has done in your church. Don't take too much credit for what God has done in your life. Don't lose track of what matters the most. When you read the book of Nehemiah, if you take away that this is a book on leadership and how to do a building campaign, then you've missed the point. It's about revival, and it's about God's hand in it. Every time we read the Old Testament, we ultimately point to Jesus. And all of this, we see God's hand at work. God has orchestrated all of this. He has set Jesus' teachings up for some powerful stuff. Just wait till we get to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24. We're going to come back to this very same book on our building campaign, and you're going to see the significance of what Jesus prophesies there. Don't take credit for everything that God does. God may give you within certain bounds, sovereignty over what he has handed to you, but ultimately he's the one in control. It's his story. All of history is his story. God gets all of the glory. Check your heart and see if you can say that with 100% honesty. And if you're taking credit for what God has done and making the story about you, making yourself the hero of the story rather than Jesus, check your heart. Don't stop praying until you can say with absolute integrity, God gets 100% of the glory for what he builds in my life.